I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Mary Kissel, my friend and co-host, is here. Mary is the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, as well as being the host of her own show, Opinion Journal, each day at WSJ.com at 1 p.m. And we go to Mary's favorite place on the planet, other than Florida, which is Australia. And we're keen to talk about politics. There's a deal of politics going on in the United States right now, Mary. Wouldn't you characterize what's going on in Washington?
This was quite a week, John.
Yeah, quite a week of politics. But there's an election eve in Australia, and everything down there right now is about the standing for re-election, the Prime Minister Gillard, and the Labour Party dominating in the legislature by just a few votes. So it's knife's edge. And so everything is about the re-election, although the formal campaign doesn't begin till September.
But they're really campaigning now, John.
And we ask for help on the campaign because this looks like, from my cynical point of view, spend and spend, elect and elect. It worked here 80 or 90 years ago for the New Deal. Does it work in Australia here in the 21st century? We're joined by John Roskam, the executive director of the Institute of Public Affairs. Mr. Roskam, I'm sure that your cup runneth over watching our domestic struggles here in the United States, IRS, AP, the Benghazi story, but we're keen on how Ms. Gillard is dealing with these very poor re-election numbers, the approval numbers, and the spend and spend proposed in the new budget. Does this work for Australia, that you can buy a vote? Good morning to you, John.
Hello, John. Hello, Mary. It has worked in the past that governments, both Conservatives and Labor-leaning, have been able to buy votes, but eventually the money runs out. And what we have likely in Australia is the left-leaning Gillard government, on all projections, is going to be thrashed. No one believes its budget predictions anymore. It was only 12 months ago that Julia Gillard's head of finance said the Australian budget would be in surplus. We have had a record deficit. We're 100 days away from the election, and people have started seeing through this government.
John, it's not just a matter of buying votes, it's a matter of trust, and you raised a really important issue. There was a $1.1 billion surplus that was forecast last October. Now you guys are looking at an almost $20 billion deficit. How does the government explain this massive swing?
Well, that's a very good question, Mary, and what the government has said is they have claimed there has been a sledgehammer taken to government revenue. Now, the problem with that claim is that, in fact, this year, government revenue has increased by 7%. Next year, it is predicted to increase by about the same rate. So many people have said, and it's true, the government doesn't have a revenue problem. They have a spending problem. And very quickly, I'll just point out to you that the point you made about trust is very important. And for your listeners, they might be interested to know that the Labor government actually has not a majority in our lower house, which is where government is formed. They rely on the votes of two independent members. Now, these two independent members come from very conservative electorates, but they support a Labor-leaning government. So if you could imagine the most conservative district in perhaps Texas or somewhere like that, that representative then voting to keep the Obama administration in power. So when we talk about trust, the trust issue goes back all the way to how Julia Gillard came to government, and it now flows through to things like the budget that we had on Tuesday night.
John, this spending proposal by the Treasurer, Mr. Swan, is it real, or is it just a promise that we'll do this if we're returned to power?
No, it's not real, John. You're correct. And if you want something even funnier, imagine a politician talking about what's going to happen in 10 years' time. So the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, and his Prime Minister said on Tuesday night that they are going to legislate tax increases and budget spending for the next 10 years. Now, given that this government doesn't know what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, the idea that any government, any politician is going to try and dictate what's going to happen in a decade's time is is ridiculous. We have a big new disability program that the Labor government is pushing, which is going to dramatically increase spending on people with disabilities. The problem is that only a third of the money needed for that program is budgeted for. So they've increased income taxes to pay for a third of the program. When they are asked, well, where is the rest of the two-thirds of money going to come from, they say, well, we have 10 years to work that out.
We had a very laudable disability program enacted here in the 90s, but now it's turned into paying people who have sort of little aches in their elbows to stay home from work for a year. John, I wanted to ask you about mothers and children, because this has been one of the big planks of the Conservatives down there, that Tony Abbott and the Conservatives want to pay women to have children. The Labor government said, I believe this week, or maybe it was late last week, that they're not going to do that. They're going to stop these cash payments for having children. Does that put Tony Abbott on the back foot? Does it make him look fiscally irresponsible?
I think it does, Mary, and that's one of the few good things that the Labor administration have pointed out, that Tony Abbott is proposing, in an effort to get more women, as you say, to have more babies, that he's going to pay up to 6 months of their annual salary to them.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, and it can't be afforded. And the point has been made that Tony Abbott is in many ways naturally conservative. He's a very strong and good Catholic, and while there might be some benefits to the idea of the program of compensating families, this is massive middle class welfare that I don't think is affordable, but he hasn't backed away from it.
Mr. Roskam, this is going to require explanation, because the carbon tax was the controversy that started the Gillard government in the slide. I read from Bloomberg, perhaps I'm reading these numbers incorrectly, that the government forecasts the carbon price will slump to $12.10 a ton in the year starting July 2015, from a previous estimate of $29 a ton.
Whoops.
Can we explain that? Were they optimistic and having a good day at the $29 and now they're gloomy?
Or they didn't expect Europe's carbon system to blow up?
Or they're unaware of the economic cycle on the globe?
So many questions.
Mary, you summed it up in a couple of letters. Oops. There's a few things about the carbon tax. One is, it comes back to trust. Julia Gillard went to the election saying there will be no carbon tax under any government I lead. So she broke that promise.
Right.
Secondly, she told Australians that the rest of the world is going to have a cap and trade system, and that Australia will not lead the world, and even though we will start with our own system within a few years, all the rest of the world, including China, including India, are going to have a similar system, so Australia will not be left out on its own. Well, that has proved, of course, completely wrong, and I think that was completely devious of the government to make that claim. Then, very optimistically, they said, well, at least the Europeans are green and stupid. They thought that their carbon price would stay up, which of course it hasn't. So now we have a problem of plummeting revenues from the carbon tax. Australia has the highest household electricity prices in the world, partly because of the carbon tax, and now no one wants to talk about the carbon tax. So we had our former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd saying, like Al Gore, this is the greatest moral challenge of our time. Now no one wants to talk about it.
John, I want you to look forward for a couple of months. If Labor continues to disintegrate like this in the polls, could we see the votes that would normally go to Labor swing to the very far left Green Party, with the rest of the nation swinging very far right? And could you have a kind of political bifurcation in Australia, similar to what we have here in the United States?
Yes, I think you could. But what will happen is you will have the Conservative Liberal Party taking the version of our Reagan Democrats, taking the working class votes, taking the votes of people who work with their hands, and in Australia, the tradesman's vote, as it were, the votes of the middle class, and then the Labor Party will be left with the rump of the Greens. And the best way of conceiving of the Greens in Australia is imagine the worst of the Californian eco-greenies running the Labor Party as it stands at the moment. So what could happen is you will have huge swathes of the electorate going to the Conservative Party, with only the left becoming very green, becoming very anti-American, becoming very anti-progress,
anti-trade,
and pushing even very much against free trade, and pushing extreme environmental policies even further than the Labor government is doing at the moment.
John Roskam is the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs in Australia. The election, as John tells us, is 100 days away, but right now the news shows that Julia Gillard, after this recent spend and spend, elect and elect, is trailing not by 10 points in the poll, but by 12. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and the host of Opinion Journal each day at WSJ.com. That's 1 p.m. East Coast time for our Australian listeners. Good morning, Australia. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.